Welcome to Algebra 1. The learning goal for this episode is to learn how to factor polynomials by grouping. Let's look at some examples. We want to factor this polynomial by grouping. We do this by grouping the terms of the polynomial together, two at a time. Then we find the greatest common factor, or GCF, of each group. In my first parentheses, x squared is the GCF of x cubed and 4x squared. In my second parentheses, 5 is the greatest common factor of 5x and 20. I then notice that I have the quantity x plus 4 as a factor of each of my groups now. Since it's a factor of each one, that means it's a common factor, and I can write my polynomial as the quantity x squared plus 5 times the quantity x plus 4. You can sort of think of this as a reverse distributive property. If you were to take this factored form and now distribute it back out, you'd work your way back up to the original polynomial. This is now factored form of this polynomial. Same idea in this example. I want to factor by grouping. So I group the terms together two at a time. I then try to find the GCF of each grouping. In this case, I can factor a y squared out of the first grouping, which leaves me with the quantity y plus 5. But when I look at the second grouping, I can't find anything to factor. The only factor that y and 5 have in common is 1. So I can write my second grouping as 1 times the quantity y plus 5 if I think it might be helpful. In this case, it is going to be helpful, so I'm going to do that. Because now I notice I have a common factor between my two groupings, the quantity y plus 5. So I can rewrite this as a product of two binomials, the quantity y squared plus 1 times the quantity y plus 5. Hopefully you can now see how it was helpful to factor out the 1. As always, I can choose to multiply this back out and work my way back up to the original if I want to check it. In this example, we're going to factor this 4-term polynomial. In this case, however, I hopefully notice that all 4 terms have something in common before I start grouping. In this case, all 4 terms have a GCF of 2. When factoring, your very first step is always to look for a GCF of all the terms. If you don't, then you'll still be able to factor, but you'll have to notice that later that you have a GCF, which is sometimes much more difficult. So always look for that GCF first. Once I factor out my GCF of 2, I can't lose track of it, so I put it outside of brackets, and I'm left with 5x cubed minus 4x squared plus 10x minus 8 inside. I now group what's inside the brackets into groups of 2 and look for the GCF of each grouping. In my first grouping, I can factor out an x squared, and in the second, I can factor out a 2. I now notice that I have a common factor of the quantity 5x minus 4. So now I can rewrite this as 2 times the quantity x squared plus 2 times the quantity 5x minus 4. This is factored form. Notice that I still have that 2 out there. That's part of my factored form. If I leave that out, it won't multiply back out to be my original polynomial. Now for our guided practice section. We're going to work through some problems together. You do not need to write down these problems. Just step through them with me. At each step, I'm going to prompt you the question you should be asking yourself. Then I'll pause for about 5 seconds for you to think about it and answer it for yourself. Then I'll show you. Our first question is, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to factor this polynomial. How do we do that? These 4 terms do not have a GCF other than 1, so we're going to group them together 2 at a time. Now what? Now we factor out the GCF of each grouping. In this case, c squared from our first group and 5 from our second group. What do we do next? We notice that we have a common factor of the quantity c plus 7, so we rewrite our polynomial in factored form as the quantity c squared plus 5 times the quantity c plus 7. This is factored form. We're finished. Let's try another one. What do we do first? Well, what we always do first is we look for a GCF of all the terms. In this case, there is one. Hopefully you notice that 3 goes into all 4 of those terms. Now what? Now we group the remaining polynomials into groups of 2. What's the next step? Next, we factor out the GCF for each group. In this case, x squared for the first group and just 1 for the second group. Now what? Now we notice we have a common factor from our groupings, so we write it in factored form. 3, our original GCF, times the quantity x squared plus 1 times the quantity 2x minus 1. We're done. Now for the self-check section. In this section, you're going to physically pause the video as you work out the problem on paper in your notebook. Then you'll press play to check to see how you did. You'll have 5 seconds to pause the video after I stop speaking before I show you the solution. Please pause the video now and work out the problem, then press play to check. Here is the solution. Please compare this to your work. Pause the video here if you need more time to compare, then press play again to move on to the next problem. Same thing on this problem. Pause the video, write down the problem and work it out in your notebook, then press play to check. Please pause the video now. Here's the solution. Again, pause the video if you need more time to compare this to your work. In closing, let's review our learning goal. We wanted to learn how to factor polynomials by grouping. We did that by grouping together 2 terms at a time, then factoring out a GCF. We then looked for a common factor to see if we could write our polynomial as a binomial times a binomial. But we also learned that we should always look for that GCF for the entire polynomial first before trying to group.